And we're joined tonight by Mr. Phillip Corso, Jr. Welcome to the program, Phillip. Do you like Phillip or Phil?
Either one. Phil's fine.
Okay, great. Well, it's great to have you here. I know you don't do a lot of interviews, and I want to say thank you so much for taking the time and the trust to be on the program to talk about your father, because as we were talking about offline, not only are there lots of myths and misconceptions, but there is a lot of, I want to say disrespect, but in a certain way, I think we can probably clear up certain misconceptions tonight by having you on the program without even having to go all that deep. So thanks again for being here.
Sure.
Why don't you start off? Some of our audience members might not know that much about your dad. What we do know is that The Day After Roswell, which was published in 1997, of course, really took the world by storm and turned it upside down in a lot of ways, both from a ufology perspective, from a technology perspective, from an intelligence perspective, and from a military perspective. So why don't you tell us about what your dad was like growing up and what kind of father he was?
Oh, sure. He was a great father. I mean, I didn't see him very much as a young boy.
I bet.
But he, as far as I'm concerned, he never exaggerated. He never cussed. He was religious, not overly. He spoiled me rotten, bought almost anything I wanted. My sons today, I have 3 sons, they still laugh about that. And, he was a great father. Later on in life, though, when my mom passed away about 5 years before 1997, he came and lived with us. And that was when I really got to know my father. Being the career that he was in, I look back now and I understand why he didn't have a lot of time for me and always get home late, and such like that.
Sure.
I forgive him for that, though, because he was a great father. He never laid a hand on me, just a very nice, pleasant person. When I hear some of the stories that when he was G2 of Rome and how he would interrogate prisoners and some other very nasty stuff, it was hard to visualize. My father is that type of person, but that's where his military career carried him.
Well, like you said, and we were talking about this offline a little bit, it's amazing how you can know someone and they have all this information in their head, but at the time, the world being such a different place back then, they were able to draw a line in the sand as far as what they'll talk about and what they just know that they're not allowed to talk about. So as far as your dad growing up, discuss some of the positions that he held. There were so many. We're talking about some very high-level positions in government.
Right. Well, I can remember as a young boy going down with him to the Blair House. The Blair House was across the street from the White House, and that's where a lot of the staff at that time stayed. And I was impressed because I would always, and there would be 2 armed guards there with Tommy guns. And, you don't see that in Washington, D.C. nowadays in the public. And I would go in there, and then another thing that always bothered me, my father was almost always in civilian clothes. And this is when he held, I'm going to say the job is Colonel North's job because more people were familiar with that later on. But my dad founded that job, and what it really was is liaison between the chiefs of staff of the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, all in the Pentagon, and Dad being on the White House staff next to Ike, he would carry Ike's orders over there. That's the way it was done in those days. So, that was a very high-profile job. And,
I'd say.
And you can look up his career on the Internet. It's there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like I said, there are some major titles that go underneath your father. That's why it is so important. And I think what we need to establish in this interview is that your dad was only on the scene, unfortunately, for a very short period of time when he decided to come forward with a lot of these revelations. And I think that was really the downfall of why we haven't been able to put him in a place where he is more of a historical significance than he was at the time. And I want to reestablish that. So keep telling us about some of these amazing positions, because the one that really ended up sparking so much controversy was when he joined the Foreign Technologies Division, correct?
Yeah. He knew General Trudeau before that, and of course General Trudeau is known for the charge up Pork Chop Hill in Korea. At the time Dad met General Trudeau in Korea, he was on the MacArthur staff as one of his head intelligence officers. Let me go back a little further. The way that Dad got started in this is he was GI, drafted into the Army, non-commissioned officer. Well, instantly in school they saw that he was had a photographic memory. And they said, come here, son, you want to be an officer? He took the officer's candidate and passed the test. And they quickly sent him to Cambridge University in England and to learn intelligence. We had no intelligence at that time prior to the war. So, and I remember Dad saying all the time that the British would say, how green our ally. In other words, we didn't know nothing they felt. So Dad learned intelligence, came back here after the war, went to Fort Riley, and taught intelligence there. And that's how his career, you might say, stepped to the next level, because then he went on to Korea. And because he had a photographic memory, he interrogated over 1,000 prisoners there himself.
Wow.
And he would believe everything they said, just the opposite of what most intelligence officers, and he stored it away. Well, pretty soon he realized, like any good Army officer, the enemy always knows how to destroy himself. So Dad was put on the Panmunjom peace talks, and he quickly, by interrogating, figured out a way to end the war. And that was they knew their weakness, and the weakness was you cut off their food supply, their rice, and the war would quickly end. And he had the Air Force take torpedoes and put delayed charges, drop them into the rice paddies for shallow running. And they went into these earth dams with delayed fuses, and bam, bam, bam. Dad said he walked into the Panmunjom meeting one day, and he says they were very arrogant, and he said they sensed that he had them. And the war ended. Now, I'm not saying my dad single-handedly ended the war.
Sure.
What I am saying is he played a large part in it on MacArthur's staff.
And did you learn about these specifics while you were growing up, or did you learn about them post when your father passed? When did you really learn about this chronology of all these major events that he was involved with?
Mainly during the 5 years that he lived with us after my mother's death.
Okay, because like you said, he wasn't around very much, understandably, while you were growing up.
Right. So then he went on to Ike's staff, and especially for the young people, I want them to hear this.
Sure.
Because Dad wrote the book mainly where the young could know. He feels that they have a right to know. He feels without them knowing that there could be a lot of problems in the future. If they know the problems, they will know how to solve them. And mainly he felt the young people could handle knowing that we have been visited and how things are taking place. And especially my sons. The book he did not get a penny from. He was cheated out of it. On his deathbed, he was very sorry that he wrote the book, and that's mainly because he didn't want to leave the family. We were sued by people back then we didn't even know. And finally, an attorney about a year later, when I was ready to burn all the notes, came to our rescue and put all the fires out in about 3 months' time. So I want the young people to know that this book was not easy coming. There was also a big controversy about Senator Thurman that wrote the foreword.
That's right.
And Senator Thurman fired the whole staff and said, "No, I did write the foreword to the book." And he fired his entire staff from the administrative assistant on down. And of course, he had been made chairman of the Armed Forces Committee by then, and it was an embarrassment to his staff, he said. And Dad, the first 1,000 books will have a foreword by Senator Thurman, and Dad dropped it just where it wouldn't drop Senator Thurman's foreword in the book after the first 1,000 because he just didn't want any more controversy because Senator Thurman was a dear friend of his.
And there was others within government. Your father was friends with many people. I'm going to come back to some of these altercations and some of the possibly after effects of launching this and publishing this historical book, but I'm really trying to lay some groundwork first on just who he was. I mean, Ronald Reagan was someone that your dad spoke to and
Very
advised.
Yeah. After Dad got out of the Army, Reagan would call often because he considered Dad the number one expert on you might say the KGB and communism and the Cold War at that time. So Reagan would take his advice.
It's incredible. Hey, you know what? We have to take a break. So what we're going to do here, we lay some groundwork on who your father was. If you haven't heard of this man, well, you're probably not a ufology buff, and that's okay. That's okay, because there's a lot to talk about tonight, and I really want you to get the true story, which is going to come from my guest tonight, Mr. Phillip Corso Jr., the son of the late, great Colonel Phillip Corso Sr. Okay, we're back now with my guest tonight, Mr. Phillip Corso Jr., talking about his dad, his father, to many, a amazing American, but to many, a guy that is definitely encased in mystery and a lot of myths and a lot of misconceptions. And we're going to discuss all of that tonight with the only person who really knows the truth, his son. So let's get into the book a little bit. Now, we know that your dad did a ton of amazingly important conventional things within government at a very important time during our history in this country. Okay, so we talked about the mindset a little bit offline. At that time, for instance, when I had Major Milton Torres on, who was a fighter pilot in WW2 and had to shoot down a UFO, was ordered to shoot one down. He didn't actually hit it, but like I said, he would have gone to his grave when he was on the program. He told us he would have gone to his grave with this information. It was a different time, and there was a sense of nationalism. People really believed in the cause, and your father was on board with this, was he not?
Yes, he was. In fact, I think it would be very important for the younger people to know something, that the reason this is covered up is because it wasn't meant to be covered up. And I know that sounds a little bit of an oxymoron, you might say, but here's the way it happened.
Okay.
Dad being on the White House staff, I called him in, and he says, Phil, where are they from? And he says, I don't know. He says, what do they want? And Dad says, we don't know. He says, well, what do we know? And Dad says, well, he says, what we know is you and I are old soldiers, and they did penetrate our airspace. So let's treat them as foe, and let's also, my advice is, let's say nothing. So saying nothing, apparently, to the CIA, FBI, NSA, all that at that time, meant cover it up.
Sure.
My dad says it was never meant to be covered up. So
Wow.
They jump on this bandwagon to justify their own jobs, and here you go, a big cover-up. So when Dad was doing signings for the book at many Air Force bases, he was telling me that generals and colonels were coming up and all this and that, and they're saying, we can't even tell our wives what we've been doing for the last 20 years. He says, we sure would like to have this monkey off our back, and you are right on with the book, So, that's kind of the mindset, you might say, of why it's being covered up. It's just an old agenda that will probably never go away until these old fossils die off. Of course, I'm an old fossil, too.
Well, but let's get into that for a second, because I think it's really important. People don't understand the layers of secrecy. Sometimes I don't. It not only is it complex and complicated, but sometimes it's redundant and full of idiocy, is it not? That's
absolutely.
What you're saying. Yeah.
In fact, Dad says most of the artifacts were lost from the Roswell crash.
Wow.
And they're still sitting somewhere in bureaucracy. And if it hadn't been for the file cabinet that was brought up to Dad, it would have been lost. Now, you got to understand, the book was not important to Dad. He was writing his memoirs. And there was a little paragraph in there that George Knapp, a ufologist out in Vegas, picked up and said to my dad, would you elaborate on this? I mean, we got turned down 12 times on Dad's memoirs. Who wanted memoirs from an old colonel,
Right.
So that's the way the book happened. Now, Dad did not set out to tell the truth or anything like that. It just happened. And if George Knapp hadn't picked it up, it would have never been written because Dad didn't feel it was important. He had 9 clearances above top secret. Until he wrote the book, our family knew nothing.
That's amazing.
I had suspects, but I never, because I had some strange things that have happened to me when I was in the desert, and Dad was also in, when we were in New Mexico and such. But I always spoke about them to my dad, and he always said, "Oh, forget it. Don't bother." I had some photographs. He says, "Oh, don't." He had them taken away from me, actually. And that's a whole nother story.
But let's talk about that for a second. So Knapp, who most people on this show know, he's an icon for sure as an investigator. He does a really quality job. He focused in on this by chance, read a paragraph about your father talking about what specifically?
Talking about his days in R&D between 1960 and 1963 when he seeded alien artifacts into the society and business and corporations.
So basically, Knapp's eyes go bazooto, wide-eyed. He contacts your pop and encourages him to elaborate on this story. So does he do a one-on-one interview, and then how does that lead to this historical book? Well,
like Dad said, he was the classifying officer on most of this for Ike, right?
Sure.
So he said when they came to him and didn't want him to write it, and the book was put through with no legal, it was the fastest book in history to ever go through Simon & Schuster, and they did all this before it could be stopped. And Dad, when they came to him afterwards and wanted to try him for treason and such, he says, How can you do that? He says, I was the classifying officer, so I declassified it. Who better to declassify it than myself?
What a great answer.
Yeah. But it did cause a lot of problems, too. I mean, we have been through literally hell.
And I'm going to get into that. I definitely want to touch on that, Philip. I don't mean to cut you off, but I want to do this in segments so that people can digest it. Because there's a lot that your dad did for the sake of this country, so it would seem, in my opinion, and especially talking to you offline, there's a sincerity here. Your dad did the right thing at a time when we needed it. And unfortunately, he just isn't around anymore. So you've had a bad taste in your mouth about a lot of these things. We're going to get to that. But when the book came out, let's even go back before that. Your dad elaborates on this story with Knapp. How does the book come to fruition? And what were your thoughts all of a sudden when you got all this information, whether you saw the manuscript or whether you sat down with your dad and all of a sudden, oh my God, how did I not know about this? And this is incredible.
Right. Well, at first, disbelief, the whole family disbelief, But then we knew my father. I never knew my father to tell a lie, never knew him to cuss, never knew him to exaggerate. So with those type of qualities, he's not lying. And besides, he was a grandfather that wrote the book mainly where my sons could know. And why would a grandpa lie? I mean, it's not there. It's not in the books.
We talked about this. He had everything to really he had everything to lose.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, when he passed away, he did lose. I mean, it was just a terrible time. Like I said, no money from the book. He was hoping to send my boys to college with the money. That was one of his main reasons, besides letting them know some things that he had done. It's better now. In the last 12 years, things have changed. Because of the Internet, more of the younger people are educated. They understand. They're ready for it. And our government needs to get off of it. In other words, our government needs to mature. Now, here's the maturity part.
Okay.
When Dad and General Trudeau released these artifacts, especially the integrated circuit, they weren't sure if it was going to be good or bad. Now, we know to every great invention there's both good and bad. For instance, the Wall Street thing that just happened that crashed our economy couldn't have happened without the computer. We know that, so it was used for bad.
Right.
So they were worried about that. They were very concerned about putting these artifacts out. And, it is a concern. But I will say this, in the last 12 years, because of the Internet, the good part of it is that it has educated people, especially the young people, that are going to have to take over and maybe deal with ET. And that's what needs to be done. Our country's cover-up, in my opinion, is continued now because of embarrassment. And, for instance, you have this big, bad Air Force that is the greatest, strongest in the world, and all of a sudden a ship comes in and my dad says takes one of the Roswell crashes back. There were several crashes. And they just take it back and nothing can be done about it. Well, you certainly don't want the public to know that, would you, Jesse?
No, absolutely not. In fact, what I wanted to talk about a little bit, because you work in experimental aircraft as a profession, and I wanted to ask you about the technology that was discussed in the book, because some people have not read this book. There are still a couple people out there. Can you tell us your thoughts regarding the tech that we gained from these recovered crafts? I mean, the story, the book tells the story that your father was put in charge of the wreckage from the Roswell crash, extraterrestrial crafts, and he had them back-engineered, and from back-engineering these crafts, technology was gained, and they took the technology and funneled it through private corporation, correct?
Right, correct.
So tell us about some of the amazing types of technology that blew your mind when you started reading about this stuff.
Well, of course, you know, we have integrated circuit, we have the fiber optics, we have the super tenacial fibers, carbon fibers and such that I use every day.
Mm-hmm.
And we have laser, we have the integrated circuit and such, which all came from this. Now, here's kind of the shame of it, Jesse. There was an Army Jeep there at the time. The Air Force had just been formed. The Army Jeep is the artifacts that my dad got, which wasn't very much. The Air Force has the rest. Dad criticized, not the Air Force, but the Secretary of the Air Force for holding this stuff back. And they held it back and only let their brain pool, which was very small, work on it. When my dad and General Trudeau released it to the world through the corporations, you had the entire world's brain pool to work on these and bring them to their science.
How did they choose the corporations and the companies to funnel this technology through, Philip?
Yeah, very good question. My dad said in the front of the book there's 50 companies. By the way, all 50 answered him when he wrote the book.
Interesting.
50 years later. So I think that's pretty amazing.
It is.
Yeah, and the way that he funneled it was he knew that the Germans had a UFO. So Fort Belvoir was in night vision. They had the German night visions there. So Dad would put the artifacts where they were already being worked on. He put them in Bell Labs where there was already a laser being worked on, where there was already integrated circuit worked on. He put them into companies and gave them a budget. Now, here's the interesting thing. He did not give them the artifact. General Trudeau and them would fund them, tell them what to work on. Now, remember something. If you have an artifact in your hand, you know that they're working in the right direction, right?
Sure.
Yeah, you're not going down the limb of a tree and you're going to have to cut it off and start again, you know. So you're going in the right direction. Now, if they begin to flounder, he says, then he would bring in the artifact, give it to them, and they would give it back. The neat part about he knew Stalin's number one mandate was to steal Roswell technology, which it was. So they were smart enough to say to the corporations, take it, do the patents, keep the patents, do anything that you want with it, sell it to the public, but we get number one priority, the military, on it. So that's basically how it was done.
That's amazing. Hold that thought. We got to take a break. My guest tonight, telling the truth about his father and basically talking about a lot of misconceptions. And if you haven't heard the story or read the book The Day After Roswell, you're going to want to pick it up after hearing this conversation. My guest tonight, Mr. Phillip Corso Jr., talking about his father, Colonel Phillip Corso Sr., coming back after the break. This is Jesse Randolph. You're listening to UFOnaut Radio on KPAM 860. Wow, that's really interesting, Philip. The part about Stalin, I'm going to bring you back on that when we come back from the break real quick, because I don't think a lot of people knew that.
Dad was real big, too, on the missing, MIAs. He testified before he died in Washington on that. And the KGB leader says Corso knows more about us than anybody in the world.
That's interesting. I'm also curious. I'm going to bring you back in. We'll do it on the air.
Sure.
Okay, we're back now with Phillip Corso Jr., Welcome back to the program. And where we left off, you threw out this tidbit that I want to circle back around, which was that Stalin at the time was hell-bent on getting a hold of Roswell technology, according to your dad. Can you tell us about that some more?
Well, yeah, that was his number one mandate, and of course it would be. And later on, just to show you, this, I think Khrushchev was in at this time, or Gorbachev, I'm not sure, probably Khrushchev. But Dad says when he was in R&D in 60 to 63, he says they would see Russian technology come out with, for instance, they would have an SST aircraft. They would have a space shuttle. And Dad says they would just sit there and laugh because they know he didn't have the technology to make it work. They were just copying our devices, and they were just hollow shells that couldn't do nothing. Of course, you know the space shuttle was never used. The SST, they had to go to the British to get the fuel controls, you know. So it was more or less a joke with Dad and such because they knew that we were so far ahead in the technology ends of it. That
was it blind luck that the Roswell crash happened on our soil? Could have not just happened in Moscow or in the Ukraine, and then
it did.
Okay.
It did.
Okay.
Dad said there were crashes in Nazi Germany, there were crashes in Russia, and there were many crashes in this country. But it's the question of what to do with it, how to do with it. I mean, think about this.
Okay.
From the 1947 to 1960, that dang stuff just sat in a file cabinet in the Pentagon. It went all the way to the top, reached the top, and that was it.
It's amazing.
In a file cabinet.
And it's so believable, too. If you know
stupidity.
our government, and you've seen that Indiana Jones scene at the end with the big warehouse full of stuff.
Yeah.
And you're just sitting here going, James Fox was on the program last week saying the same thing. There's a place that has all these artifacts.
Mm-hmm.
And the real I-beams that Jesse Marcel Sr. saw, and the wreckage, and the bodies that Jackie...
I told Dr. Stephen Greer, I said, you want technology, you just don't know where to look. It's there, you know? And if the Air Force would let you into some of their hangars, it's probably just sitting there. If they haven't taken it back, Dad said they came and took one back, you know? And then
they took.
Hold on, Dad would go out of the country.
They took it back. Who's they? You mean the extraterrestrials took back some of their technology?
Yeah, absolutely. They recover their crafts. Yeah, and there's nothing that can be done.
Kind of tow truck kind of thing.
That's what happened in England. You know, in what's it called, Vicksburg or
Kecksburg?
Texas. Yeah, that's all that happened there. They just came and got it back.
They came and got back their stuff.
Yeah, got their stuff back. And
well,
Dad
that makes sense.
says it's a big embarrassment. And also they disarm. Dad says every single space shuttle had a UFO following it. NASA just keeps it quiet.
Well, we definitely know that from the NASA Select tapes and plenty of testimony. But let's do this. So let's try to get a little chronology going here because there's so much to talk about. So your dad comes forward. Knapp talks to him. He decides from there, I'm going to write this book because not only he wants to get the word out to people about what he did and why he did it, but also because he thought he might be able to assist his family financially, possibly with college and such, correct?
Sure.
So now the floodgates are open for you to talk to your dad about all these amazing, mysterious things that he was in charge of. You must have been like, hey, Dad, I got another question for you.
No, actually, I was pissed.
That's awesome. See, now we're getting transparency here, John. I like this.
See, I had a set of photographs. I ran away in the desert in El Paso, Texas, took some pictures of UFO and so on. I don't want to go into that.
Sure.
It's not important. But he took the pictures away. A friend of mine came back from Vietnam. He says, oh, I know the guy in the Fort Bliss Night Vision Laboratory. I get your pictures back. He got my pictures back. I showed him back to Dad. He almost fell over. Now, this is before I knew anything, right?
Okay.
And he says, I told you those damn pictures would get you in trouble. So he takes them again. He says, I gave him to General Sammet. I gave him to Gene Dixon. He would always lie, you know. And it made me mad. I wanted my pictures back, you know. So there's a whole other story to the pictures another time, but I'll just tell you this.
Fair enough.
We were sitting down in Lantana before the book was written. That's a boatyard down here, and Dad was eating lunch with a guy named David Loseley. And he was a black belt, but he also studied this I don't know what art it is where you look at Chinese, you look at the eyes, and you can tell the impurities in the bodies and respiration and so on. And I think it's a part of black belt. But I asked my dad for the pictures back at that dinner table. Well, Dad got up and went to the bathroom, and David says, you know, your father knows more about this subject. His respiration just went up to 180-something, and he got irritated. And, you know, he could read the faces and stuff. And he says, I wouldn't ask him that anymore. He says at his age, you know. So I knew something was up, you know.
And then how does that translate into he's writing a manuscript with Bill Burns called The Day After Roswell?
Yeah, well, we don't know how Bill Burns entered the picture. I want to clear this up, too.
Please.
There's parts in the book that Dad was very upset with, and I'm going to call it Hollywood, okay?
Sure.
Bill Burns said it was necessary to sell the book, which it probably is. You know, I'm still not going against Bill Burns, but he was a horror writer before that time, so he hammed it up a little bit. We have a book where Dad X'd everything out that he didn't like, you know, which I'm going to put out on the Corso files soon. And I wanted people to know this, too. Dad left a lot of writing. And once you read Dad's writings, which we're going to call the Corso files, you begin to understand that the world is a different place than most people view it to be. This is me saying this, okay? It's just me. It's just a feeling. It's just conjecture, not based on anything. But I feel that our world is not only artificial and simulated, but I think our world is artificial, period.
When you say artificial, tell me exactly what you're trying to say. You know, I'm thinking the Matrix here as you're talking.
Yeah, I not so much a Matrix, but it was created. The Matrix are part of it, but it was created for us. And then you get into all ufology goes into God and understanding, you know, and gets, you know, you look at the old frescoes with UFOs on them, and you go back to the ancient Sumerians, you know, with Edgar Ascension and such, and you know, ancient aliens. You begin to understand that they have been here for a long, long time. But we're entering what we call the modern age, and now we have explanations for them. We have Star Trek. We can call them beginning to understand, you might say, the gods with little g's, you know. Mm-hmm. We're beginning to understand the demigods now, that maybe it's just technology and that our world was created here for us. I think we are far more than what we are. One of the things that Dad was very worried about and the other generals, by the way, Dad did Operation Paperclip for Ike that brought all the German scientists here, and they worked for Dad.
Wow.
Okay? Yeah.
So you're talking about von Braun?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And they all worked for Dad, and with them talking to Dad and the understanding of science and stuff, the consensus was that they have been here for a long time. And my father happened to have a conversation with E.T., and von Braun said he was very, very privileged to have had that happen, because von Braun and some of the Germans also knew about E.T., you might say.
Well, if you're not familiar with Paperclip, basically I tell people when you say a lot of people don't understand how this country works, I tell people to set them off keel sometimes. Did you realize that ex-Nazis were responsible for the Apollo program success?
Oh, absolutely. You know Project Horizon that's in the back of the book?
Mm-hmm.
I saw that as a young man 10 years prior to us going to the moon.
Tell this audience what Project Horizon is.
Project Horizon was by von Braun, the first docking of spacecraft in space. It was the first moon base, all the way carried through. And when I saw it as a young man, it was on my dad's desk at home, marked top secret, about 2 inches thick. And let me just say this to people. We were on the moon 10 years before Kennedy said it's a great thing, we're going to go at the end of the decade. We were there then, so Kennedy didn't say such a great thing.
Wait, so we were there in what capacity?
Military.
So you're saying that we had military aircraft capable
military rock. We were on the moon. Now, here's another thing. One of the astronauts came back. I know Edgar Mitchell. I met him.
Okay.
And I know some of the other astronauts. Now, one of them, I forget which one it is, came back, and he actually got mad at the head of NASA and was going to punch him out. And he says, this is quoted somewhere, how dare you send us there on bicycles when the military is there in Ferraris?
Who said that?
I don't know if it wasn't Edgar Mitchell, but it was one of the, I don't know, Dad knew John Glenn real well, but it was one of the other astronauts. I'm not sure which one it was. You'd have to look it up, but it's documented. It's there.
But in essence, Philip, think about it for a second. And I told you this offline. Your dad's story, his book, and I don't understand why you would need to ham it up if you're Burns, because honestly, the bare, raw story, the facts of what he's saying are so riveting and universally amazing. The book has been translated in how many languages?
5 I know of.
Okay. I mean, why would you need to ham it up?
Well, he felt the first 2 chapters, for instance, are just nonsense, okay? It's just bull. And he felt that a lot of people would not know what Roswell was. You know, maybe he was right 12 years ago. I don't know. They wanted the book outside of the mainstream of ufology, and it didn't make it, of course.
Sure. It was a New York Times bestseller.
Well, it was, but it really didn't make it to the general public, you know, like if it was one of Oprah's books, you know.
Well, sure, but I think one of the reasons for that is the subject matter, and that's just something that's always going to be a stalemate. We were talking about that with Fox's movies last week, James Fox. He comes out with a film called I Know What I Saw with all these amazing military witnesses. You've seen it. Mm-hmm. And goes to the National Press Club, and it's a big who cares to the mainstream media. He's not doing Oprah.
Absolutely.
Spielberg won't allow any of his quotes that he sent him to be utilized in coordination or in capacity, any capacity with the film to help elevate it in that Oprah-like status if it was one of her book list titles. Mm-hmm. Listen, we got to take our last break here. Let's break. When we come back, I want to talk about some of the things that happened to your dad post-release of this book, because a lot of mudslinging and hopefully some positive things. I hope so. So when we come back, let's do that. Let's pay homage to your father and talk about some of these amazing things that he had the courage to speak up about. And let's touch on, if we can, before we go into our bonus extended hour here into hour 2, about some of the people who came forward to support your dad. And I'm sure there's probably many. So hang tight. We'll be right back with my guest tonight, Mr. Phillip Corso Jr., talking about some pretty amazing things I didn't think that I was going to even hear tonight, but here we are. We'll be right back. This is UFOnaut Radio on KPAM 860. Okay, we are back with Phillip Corso Jr., our guest tonight, and it's been an amazing hour already, learning so much about your father, probably the most important person in history that had dealt with the technology of extraterrestrial spacecrafts and what to do with it. What a burden it must have been at first when he sat down for this job and someone handed him the keys to the kingdom of the galaxy, basically, when it comes to technology and the world. It must have been quite a burden. Could you imagine going home and trying to fall asleep that night?
Well, that's what Dad said when he first saw the body in Fort Riley. He said it upset him, but he said, I'm just going to store it away as an intelligence officer would and forget about it. It will reappear, you know, in the future, probably.
Tell us about the bodies that he did see and what his take on them. A lot of people have been saying that many of the extraterrestrials that have been collected on this planet are more of a drone-like, possibly robotic-type creature.
Well, I'm going to say something that might get me in trouble here.
Uh-oh.
I've seen the Walter Reed autopsy report.
Oh.
And they were, as Dad says, extraterrestrial extraterrestrial biological entities. And they were clones. They had no emphatic. In fact, I have a whole chart that says exactly what they were and how they look.
And where did you get this, Phillip?
He just gave me a dirty look.
Uh-oh. Well,
Dad wrote it. Dad wrote it from memory.
Okay.
You know, from the autopsy reports. And, you know, let me just tell the people a few things.
Please.
Kind of interesting. There's no lymphatic system. You know, there's no stomach. There's no reproduction organs. And the outer skin is a cloth. Was the miracle wrinkle-free cloth that comes back, bulletproof. The neat thing that people don't know about the metal is the metal could crumble, and it was very hard to penetrate. But the neat thing was when they sent it to Bell Labs and Harris Labs, they put frequency to it, and it would become opaque. It would become clear, and it would pass radiation through it. Without the current there, it would pass no radiation. Now, here's what's very important about that.
Okay.
Dad says we cannot travel in space as a species. So we would have to have that type of material. Also, the ship had a field around it. Now, this is my subject. I like the ship because I build experimental aircraft.
Sure.
And it had a field around it, and this field propagated them, and that's the way that they took their energy direct from the Van Allen belt or the magnetic field around the ship. And we are still at least 200 years away, Dad said, from building this type of shielding to travel in space. So it's just nonsense. We're not going anywhere.
Well, when your dad explained that, did he try to establish or talk about where these beings were from? And did you actually see this report? Is this something that you have on your wall or in a file somewhere, this autopsy report you're talking about that he drew?
Well, I'm not going to go there where it came from. I'm just going to say I have it, and
Understood.
I'm sure it's accurate. Let me say this. I have no top secret merchandise. Okay, so, if anyone's listening, I have nothing. It's just conjecture on my part. But let's say this also, on the other side of it, make it an enigma. I never knew my dad to tell a lie. So if he said something, it was usually not exaggerated, as I'm already repeating. So when I say man can't travel in space, that was the consensus of Operation Paperclip and all of them. And he knew.
So then how did Apollo come to be? Do you believe that we actually went to the moon?
No, it has nothing to do with it. We call this friendly space. That's between the Earth and the moon. There's gravitational field. You still reckon. Why haven't we ever sent a man into unfriendly space, out the other side, and go out maybe 1 million miles and come back? You know why? Instant death. I mean, lights out. No, not coming back disturbed, not coming back, with bone marrow problems. I mean, it's just lights out.
So what you're saying is
we can only live within our own egg, and that's it. And that's why they were extra biological entities. They were built to travel in space.
So the creators of these entities had the same limitations that we have?
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah, and also it was dimensional travel. They knew that.
So they were not traveling. For instance, what you're trying to say, let me just get this right.
Olbert is one that was very big in this, one of the fathers of the atomic bomb. He lived here in Palm Beach. Dad knew him quite well. I mean, when these scientists, these are the top brains in the world, when they make these conclusions, it's based upon pretty much fact.
Well, did he talk about where these drones came from?
Dimensional.
So they actually didn't.
My dad talked the fifth dimension a lot, and he said also they play rough.
They play rough?
They play rough. He said, yeah.
Interesting.
In other words, Russia was told to close down. He told me the Berlin Wall was coming down almost 5 years before it happened. I said, "Oh, Dad, you're delusional." He says, "Nope." He says Russia put nukes in space and they've been told to close. Pretty amazing, huh?
Yeah. I mean, every other sentence you're saying is pretty amazing.
Oh, I know. I got dozens of them.
Well, but here's the thing. It's so unbelievable.
He was in the know. Remember, he knew every important person in the world at that time, including the KGB generals, including Khrushchev, including all these people. When Reagan says we may have to fight a war, that was for a reason. Now, Dad, they would not release him. Don't think every president knew, because they didn't.
Sure.
They had to fit the profile, Dad said.
They had to fit the profile.
Yeah.
Okay.
John McCormick, old Speaker of the House, fit the profile. Congressman Feehan, Senator Thurman, John Glenn. These guys fit the profile. They knew.
So what about right now? It's 2011. Let's fast forward a little bit. Mm-hmm. How are they able to keep a lid on this stuff still? And people are just as afraid within government and the Beltway, it would seem, to discuss this topic. How many people do you think know? There is a foreign technology division, correct? Mm-hmm. And are they involved? Who is housing this kind of stuff? Because it sounds like to me that we have the technology according to what you're talking about, propulsion-wise, to travel interstellar and to do all sorts of amazing things that we see in science fiction. But you're saying biologically it's absolutely impossible for us to survive it.
That's right.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And NASA knows this, and that's why they're not too popular. And why do you think we haven't been back to space? We've also been told to stay out of space.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah. Well, apparently there's guidelines. There's timing, and you say cover up. Cover up is, Dad says the government covers itself up in its own stupidity. You got to remember who we elect. This will get me in trouble, but these people that we elect are lawyers. They belong to a brotherhood. They are faithful to their brotherhood, and they're mostly lawyers that can't make it in any other field, in their own field, so they jump on a bandwagon of politics.
Wow.
We have to be careful who we elect, and that's why the cover-up is, because they're not too smart, but they think that we are totally stupid. So it's not released. It's just not talked about.
Well, from this conversation, and I think this is a good place to pause because we have to take our last break here. And for everyone else listening out here, I think our next step is we're going to go on over to UFONautradio.com for our second hour of our interview with Phillip Corso Jr. And what I want to talk about when we come back is some of the fears involved when your dad did release this book, and some of the, let's just say, the heritage and the lasting impressions that your dad had before he died on what was going to happen in the future. Okay, back now with Phillip Corso Jr. for Hour 2 here at UFONautradio.com. Welcome back. You know, we're going in so many directions. It's
Right.
so amazing because every line that you are touching on is just wide-eyeing me. So why don't we do this? You spoke about the fact, you mentioned the moon. You talked about the fact that we've been told to stay out of space by certain folks. Let's go into that. You have guys like John Lear coming on the program sometimes saying that the moon is actually habitated. There's atmosphere, there's grass, there's trees and water and people living on the moon on the far side that we never see. What do you think about that?
I can't say anything about that except for that I saw the Project Horizon again, and I knew we were on the moon 10 years prior to Kennedy saying we were going there, the military. I didn't know that. I saw it as a young boy. I was amazed with it.
But who told us to stay out of space and why?
E.T. said to stay out of space because the Russians put nukes in space. Dad said, he said they were told to close. President Reagan. Yeah.
And the Star Wars program played a factor in this, correct?
The Star Wars program was started by my dad.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, that's even stronger.
Tell us about
the anti-missile missile was started by my dad. My dad took the first nukes to Europe. Ike let him off to do that. Let him off the White House staff to go do these things. He showed me the first DEW weapon, which is in a museum in White Sands, New Mexico, that he helped engineer. He helped engineer the anti-gravity devices on the B-2. I shouldn't say that.
Oops.
Yeah, every sentence it gets better, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, you're talking about anti-gravity devices on the V2.
Actually, field density device, but that's a better term for it.
Well,
yeah, absolutely.
Let's get back to the technology because it keeps coming.
Technology. Let me tell you something Dad said.
Please.
Yeah, he said every year we have exponentially we go up. That we have more technology than the year before and all the previous years in history. That's how fast exponentially technology goes up. He saw the integrated circuit and all of the other scientists as a living entity, and it still may come to be. In other words, we were invaded by the Roswell craft. Call it an invasion if you want.
But it was an accident, correct? It wasn't...
No, it was not an accident.
Okay, tell me what you know about that.
We'll go somewhere else right now. I don't want to go into that part.
Understand. And for the audience listening...
That's why I say the world is more synthetic than most people think.
Philip, how do you sleep at night sometimes with all this information?
Not very good.
I mean, I don't sleep well, but if I had these kind of things floating around in my head, and I do, but I don't have
there's a lot more.
acknowledgement.
We've only touched the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole lot more. My dad was a very strange character. I had an astronaut recently told me that, your family is thought of out here as being E.T., and I said, well, you're not too wrong. I said, with the things that we know, it's not saying that I know everything, but the involvement of time travel is one of my favorite subjects.
Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, I was born, and I was dead for 8 minutes. And something took place there that Dad never really told me about. But he and my Uncle Pat, he taught me to communicate mentally with himself when I was 5 years old. And I, of course, didn't think too much of it at the time because I was just a little boy, but mainly he told me I was born on Halloween, so it was okay to do these things.
Are you talking about telepathy?
Yeah, and a lot of other mental tricks that my dad taught me. And I just wonder where he had learned them, And they used to buy me erector sets at 5 years old. And I look back now, and it was pretty elaborate, and I'd put them together, and he'd just laugh, and they'd say, well, we knew. Now, the Germans Germans did a lot of experimenting, as you well know, with genetics.
Yes.
Now, Dad did say this, which is very important for the young people to hear. He says, before he passed away, that we had caught up with E.T. technically. But the one part that we are far behind in, he said, was genetics. And he left a paper called Genetic Bombs, and boy, is it scary of what could happen in the future.
So wait a minute. This is interesting because what you're trying to say, if I'm getting this right, is that we're actually on the same technological advancement level as our counterparts?
That's right.
And are we talking about one group here, or did he discuss multiple groups?
Well, I know that he has had conversations with two groups.
Personally?
Yeah.
And it was through telepathy, or was it verbally? Did he describe it?
Well, he described one in the Pentagon, that there was a room like a jail cell, he said, and he never said what was in there now, so, I truly don't know myself, but he did say this. You go in there, you were allowed to take nothing with you, no paper, no nothing, everything had to just be verbal, And he says you come out of there is like an oracle. He says any answer that you wanted, future, past, anything. He says the answer would be given to you.
So obviously spiritually, and that's where you bring in genetics. I'm saying spiritual, but they have some sort of technological advancement in that respect.
Yes.
So if we're guided by ETs, what's their intent, in your opinion? Do you have one?
I'll tell you their intent. I think it's very easy to understand from what Dad said. The conversation he had with one said this. He asked him if he was friend or foe, and he said neither. Then he asked him, what do you want? And he says, a new world if you can take it. And that's been entered into the UN as a slogan.
And what do you think what would you interpret that to mean?
I mean, it's like, I interpret it myself to mean like they don't really care one way or the other. It's up to us. They're not going to force us to be a benevolent society if that's not what we want to be. In fact, Dad said that they're quite disgusted with us. Exactly.
Are they humanoid? Did he discuss that? Because we're not talking about the drones here that they send.
Well, the one that he has had a conversation, the first one, is nothing. He drew a picture of it. I have a picture of it, and it's nothing like anything that I have ever seen before.
Well, can you describe it a little bit for us?
Yeah, it was in a silver uniform, very thin. It was about as tall as 5'7", 5'8", average, and it had a suit on, silver, and it had a headpiece on, and it had an amethyst or a ruby in the middle of its forehead. And as a young boy, I had that ruby, and I'm not going any further than that.
Okay, fair enough. And the audience knows...
I don't want to put myself into a position of being looked at. I'm talking to young people now. I don't want them to think that I'm crazy. Someday, I'm 67. Before I die, I might tell all of my experiences also.
Well, that's interesting, too. And that's
very odd ones.
That's a good point.
Very odd. They don't fit the pattern of anything else that you've ever heard.
Well, Philip, why do they keep coming, then, if they don't care?
Oh, I don't know. I guess it's like God spanking your hand, you spanking your child, and you're disgusted with them, and then the next thing you love them, I don't know. It's just my picture of it,
Okay, so let's get back to the book for a second. So the book's released in 97. It's published. Mm-hmm. And the reaction from the military within your father's circles is what?
Well, you remember that the final word from the Air Force came out, the crash dummy?
Sure.
Part. It was only a few months after that. I think it was to debunk the book.
Interesting.
So, when we were in Roswell, we had a guy. I'm just going to say Mr. X, ex-CIA. By the way, Dad knew all the CIA. He fought with them quite a bit. He fought with Edgar J. Hoover. He's called Dad a rat, but they respected each other.
Okay.
Dad would work with him all the time. But anyway, this man, when Dad was doing a film, when the book came out at the crash site in Roswell, my dad says, "You see that guy over there?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "He's a CIA ex-agent." He says, "Go over there and give him a message for me." I said, "Okay." So I went over there and stood in front of the guy. The guy moved aside. I stood in front of him again. But this time he's catching on that I'm being rude. So he says, "Young man, why are you doing that?" I said, "My dad got a message for you." And he said, "What's that?" And my dad says, "Why are you still covering it up? It's an old agenda. Why don't you give it up? You're still doing in retirement what you did in life, and there's no reason for it." That man came to breakfast the next morning and apologized to my dad, and now he's a big UFOlogist.
Really?
Yeah, so you see what that's doing. What I'm saying here is they're still carrying an old agenda that is outdated. What do they have to do? They carry it into retirement. It's a cover-up that doesn't need to be.
Well, what do you think could actually turn the tide or move the needle in the other direction? Do you have any idea?
I don't know if they have to die off.
Okay.
I don't know if they have to die off or if the damn thing has to land on the White House lawn. I don't know. I wish I knew. And
that's always the $1 million question, right? Which is, why don't they just land on the White House lawn? Mm-hmm. It changes the answer that I usually give people after speaking with you to a certain degree, because it's a lot more elaborate.
Yes.
And it's a lot more, there's a lot more sociological implications, of course.
Well, they've been here they've been here since the very beginning of time, and they have more time in the world. They're not governed by our laws, they're not governed by our thinking. So if they want to help, but Dad says also they play rough.
They play rough.
By the way, this is very important, I believe.
Okay.
The Cold War was mainly a war with the UFOs that was covered up.
How so?
They were raping us. They were taking abductions. They were interfering with our military bases, interfering with our rockets, disarming us. So we have been at war with them.
Was it a joint effort between us and the Russians?
Absolutely.
So we were aligned the entire time?
Our entire time, yeah. It's been one world for a long time, and not the world order. It's been one world with the great military establishment.
But obviously, if they had wanted to destroy us or come here to penetrate and take over the planet, they probably could have by now, correct?
Well, they could have, but remember, I told you technology, we caught up. In other words, the Star Wars, was a planetary defense system. It's still there.
It's still there. It's functional.
Yeah. Of course. So is the HARP program. That's part of the HARP. I've met the people that build the transformers.
So the HARP program is basically an alien defense system?
Yes. Cold War, yeah. We've been at war against these, whatever they are, nomads, pirates, I don't know. I don't have any idea.
Well, Stephen Hawkins tried to tell us that we should fear them this past year.
Right. He's probably right, because Dad says they play rough.
And Stuart Swerdlow, who was part of an MK Ultra project, who's been on this program, said that he's never heard or seen any transmissions from any extraterrestrial race that has been positive in nature. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've noticed being involved in this subject, Philip, is that, and this is why I tell people usually that they don't want this to be a reality, is because it definitely has a dark side. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes. Human beings have a dark side.
Yes, they do.
Let's say, for the lack of talking here, lack of understanding, that the possibility that it's our future is a very viable possibility, in my opinion.
Interesting. Like, in certain respects, we're looking at a mirror.
Yeah. And, God-wise, maybe that's all we get is ourselves. Maybe. I mean, I'm not trying to influence anyone because I don't really know, but that's kind of my feeling. I am a Christian man, though. I'm going to stay with my religion until proven otherwise. And but that's a feeling, a gut feeling.
So when your dad released the book and then the Frenzy came out, obviously everyone wanted to talk to him, and a lot of people have good intentions and some have bad intentions.
Right.
Fast forward a couple years later, how did your dad feel about the book, and how did he feel about what it did to his life and your life?
Well, he was sorry he wrote the book on his deathbed.
He was.
Yeah. And he said something on his deathbed that I really don't want to say right now, but it kind of put the whole thing into perspective to me. And that's that we are beings with an agnostic spark. We will achieve, you might say, heaven if we keep trying. What we have to realize is the UFO cover-up is not a UFO cover-up. It's a time travel cover-up. That's all that the military or the Air Force cared about. And I have met people that have been involved in time travel. In fact, one gentleman just died last year, Beckworth, over in Tampa, and he built all of the transformers and was part of the Philadelphia experiment, which I know quite a bit about. Dad revealed that Einstein worked on that. It wasn't a fluke. And we have had time travel without control for maybe the first 10 years, but now we have a control. But it causes a lot of dilemma. In other words, they come back with excessive baggage. They're trying to use time travel as a point A to point B. It has to have a purpose, more or less a benevolent purpose to time travel. I don't want to go too much more into that, Jesse, but again, you're leading to my synthetic Earth.
Right. And I want to stay on your good side because I want to keep you on this program now and then and check in with you because
that's fine. I hope that I can eventually, like we said in the book, my dad said, he didn't say in the book, but he said that only 10% of the story has been told, Do I know the rest of the story? Yeah, I do.
That's what I'm getting.
Everything? No.
That's what I'm getting from this conversation, Philip, is that you know a lot, and you're not ready to talk about certain things because either
the spiritual side of it I'm not going to go into. The contact side of it I'm not going to go into at this time because I want the young people to not think of me as a quack, But let's say this: if the world would follow what I know, I think it could be a different place because people's opinion of what the world is and what they are will certainly change.
Understood. So, mainstream science. Mm-hmm. How much knowledge do they have about any of this? It doesn't seem as though take somebody like Michio Kaku, amazingly intelligent guy.
Right.
Is this guy just totally unaware of what we're talking about here?
Oh yeah, totally.
How can that be?
I want to talk to him. In fact, I will because I already told you a project that's coming up.
That's right.
And that's one of the reasons I do want to talk to him. String theory, all that, it needs modified. Hawkins needs modified. And we do know. We absolutely do know where it all goes, where heaven is, where earth is, and where hell is, and where all these factors figure in, and where Jesus figures in, and all. It's known, But will it upset people? Absolutely. The pictures I told you about I quit showing them because I got punched in the nose one time. I came home, told my dad, he says, see, I told you. And I said, well, why did he do it? Because you upset his world. He had everything all in line.
Right.
Now
this
is what's going on right now. If I would tell everything, I can talk to you about things right now that I could not talk about 12 years ago when Dad passed away. It would have been impossible.
Well, you've told me, and I want to ask you point blank here, are you afraid for your well-being still?
No.
Good.
I think it's hands off.
Good.
I made the deals that I need to make.
Okay. I think we can take that and digest that. What about this project? Do you want to discuss it tonight at all? Do you want to tell? Okay.
Not quite yet.
Fair enough.
I think I'm going to tell the people with the project to go get bent and get onto another horse. But right now, I haven't got there yet.
And what about your dad? As far as all these people that he knew, do you ever come in contact with any of them?
Oh yeah.
Okay. And what did they tell you?
In my hangar here walks the strangest people in the world. You want me to tell you about one of them?
Please.
The keeper of the stone for the Hopi Indians, the witch doctor, keeps the calendar.
Okay.
My wife met his son and says, we talk about, my dad or my husband talks about the same thing as you do. So he brought him up here to meet me. He came to the front of the hangar and he wouldn't come in. So I asked Don, why didn't your father come in? He says he can't. And he left. And I said, that's okay. I understand why. So he left, and then he carved me a little moose to show respect, that it wasn't meant to be, because he knew, as a witch doctor, what I knew, and it wasn't necessary to talk about it. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. In fact, that's one of the issues I've had with your dad's story, which is that we talked about this. Of course, were you there? We said that line, which is to
that was my dad's favorite line.
That was your dad's.
People, when they would debunk or not believe, he'd say, "Well, were you there?"
Right, and there's no denying the legacy and the resume that your father had. So, in that respect, I often remind people, if we can't trust the quality messengers, then who can we trust? I mean, we have to go by eyewitness testimony.
Sure.
Because we can't trust, because of technology, what we see and what we hear anymore.
Well, that's right, and that reminds me of a story. Monsignor Balducci, you probably heard of him from the Vatican.
Sure.
My wife met him. They were over there with Paula Harris, which you probably know. And he says this, long before the Pope said he wanted to baptize E.T., goes back 10 years ago. Right after my dad went to Rome, I stayed here, and my whole family went with him. And he says this, Monsignor Balducci says this, the Bible is built upon witnessing. And here you have all these thousands of people talking about these heavenly phenomena, and we're not listening to them. We should listen to them, because that's the way the Bible was built. And it's certainly true, I believe.
Wow. I guess and we can start wrapping it up here tonight, because, like I said, I want to bring you on when you have more that you could talk about and you can speak.
Well, sure. I'd like to come on and maybe, instead of getting in politics and the theology, maybe we can just talk about the science. That's what I would like. And I have a lot of things that I can talk about to the scientists out there. A lot of things that Dad knew. Now, let me give one more mystery.
Please do.
If I may. You got time?
Oh, we've got plenty of time, sir.
Okay. There's 2 weeks missing in my dad's career when you look up his military career. And he never really told me what it was, but he did say this. He said, if there is a comparison, the comparison is Job in the Bible. And I guess you know what Job did?
Yes.
He had a lot of controversy in his life. He asked God why. So God took him on a trip through the universe, and he came back, and then he understood why he had to suffer so much. So that's all Dad would say, those 2 weeks that are missing. So let the people fill in the blanks there.
Wow.
But it's absolutely true.
I'm trying to think here. It sounds like maybe your dad took a pretty wild ride.
Yeah, maybe he hitchhiked through the universe. That's what I believe. I haven't said that. That's what I believe.
I'm really bummed out that I never got to meet him. And James Fox, who was on the program last week, he's a friend of mine, and I have a lot of respect for him. And the New Guard, which is what we consider our audience to be, it's the next generation of people. And that's who you're speaking to, as you've said before in the program here. He got to sit down with your dad. And I asked him point blank last week. I said, Colonel Corso, a lot of controversy about the things he said. Tell me what your gut says, because that's all I trust at this point. I don't care about anything else. Is he real? Is he true? Is he telling the truth? And he said, absolutely. Absolutely. So I know that doesn't really matter to you because you already know in your heart and in your mind. But to a lot of other people that respect James Fox and some other people out there, first of all, we want to say, were you there out of respect for your dad and homage to him? But what do you want to say to the young people listening to this that are just getting exposed and going, oh my God, how can this be? And how can they keep it from us? And what should we do about it?
Right. That's a very good question. First of all, education. The Internet has educated, and keep educating yourself on the phenomena. When the education is there, the phenomena will reveal itself. But first, the education has to be there. I want to help with this education as much as I can to in my dad's honor and his legacy. My dad, I want the young people to know, as much as I do know about him, there was still a mystery. And my three sons, they said, Dad knew a lot more than what he told us. There's a time capsule buried out in Roswell. He told my three sons it was very important for them to be there in 2047 when it's opened.
2047?
Yeah.
There's a time capsule.
Right. He said very important for them to be there.
Wow.
I mean, I can throw phrases at you for the next 3 or 4 hours, and each one will probably be more crazy than the one that was before.
Well, I'm going to book my reservation on Priceline right after the show.
But here's the thing that I do want the young people to know.
Sure.
I'm not trying to build an ego here. I have no reason to be doing this. I make good money at the job that I'm doing, with my sons. I warn them against listening to people that are self-appointed experts, because they unfortunately don't have the father that was in the know. There's a few of them out there, Jesse Marcel and a few like that. Listen to them. But don't listen to the ones that are self-appointed, because all they do is confuse. They may have good intentions. Paula Harris is an excellent, reporter. She keeps her own feelings out of it. She's very biased.
She's very good.
Or unbiased.
She's very impartial. Absolutely.
Impartial, right. That's the proper word.
She's been on the program a few times, and I know that she assisted with translating the book in Italian, correct?
Right. And my father says that when the time comes, there's going to be an event coming. Now, this is another slinger here.
Oh, boy.
There's going to be an event coming, and Paula Harris plays very big into that event.
Really?
Yeah. Dad was G2 of Rome. And there's a book we have. We're going to call it The Day After Rome. It's just amazing the things that he did over there. He had the Pope worked for him. 2 popes worked for him. He was the underground that got 3,000 Jews moved. The first 3,000 Jews to Palestine, and the first Exodus. And he had the Secret Service working for him. And while he was the reason he was G2 of Rome, he was just a general grabbed him one day and said, "Son, you speak all the dialects." With Dad's photographic memory, he came from a little town in Pennsylvania, and there were Italians there from all over the country. So he spoke every dialect and remembered it. So they just appointed him G2 of Rome. And he never lost a single soul, never had a single building blow up. That's how tight he had it. Executed 28 people, 28 Germans.
Do you think your dad is still out there watching what's going on somewhere?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
is there anything that you want to say about that might be a little bit more enlightening, or should we leave it at that?
Yeah, just leave it at that for now.
Fair enough. Phillip Corso Jr., I have to thank you for being on the program tonight, because not only have you shed a lot of light on a lot of misconceptions, but I think really what you've brought about to this audience is that we've really just scratched the surface on Colonel Phillip Corso's life. And through you and all these amazing things that you're still yet to reveal, perhaps you can gain the trust of some shows like us and some other people that have sincere intentions and are not just looking to mudsling or debunk. We can bring on some healthy and positive discussions. For instance, perhaps my producer and myself will go out and get someone like Michio Kaku on the program and bring you on to discuss some of the science. Would you enjoy that?
Wonderful.
Okay. Well,
wonderful. I think we would have, it would be great.
Okay, well, we will...
Because the scientists need to know. You see, one of the things that many of the scientists came to Dad after the book was written, Chuck Green, Al Puthoff, so on and so on. And they all came to the house, and what they wanted to know was this, just one thing. Are we on the right path? Are we researching in the right direction? And that's mainly what needs to be known. Because remember, it's like Star Trek. When Star Trek 5, and that's the whales. They go back, and Scotty's sitting there, and he's giving the guy the matrix for transparent aluminum, right? And Chekhov says, "Well, you're messing up the prime directive. You shouldn't be giving him that." And Scotty turns and looks at him and says, "Well, how do you know he didn't invent the damn stuff anyway?"
Right.
So what I'm trying to say here is, you have advanced technology, you have back engineering. How do you know we didn't invent the damn thing anyway?
Well, according to you, I'm starting to think it's one huge cycle.
Well, it's not exactly a cycle, but this is what I will talk to the scientist about. It works in a slightly different way. It's not a time loop. No, that would be boring.
Yeah, that would...
Yeah, God wouldn't give us that.
Well, what I'd love to do is put you on the air with either Michio or someone in that realm and allow you to have a healthy dialogue without trying to figure out, like you said, specific facts, whether or not your dad was part of MJ-12 or whether or not he was directing MJ-12. That's right. Where people are getting caught up, correct?
Correct. We talked about that earlier, and that's exactly right. He had criticism. He said, "I'm on MJ-12." Remember, he wrote the whole thing from memory, so he didn't exactly dot all the I's and T's. And they said, "Well, you lied. You're not part of MJ-12." He meant to say, "I'm the one that they reported to." They brought the reports to for Ike. So, sometimes the words were not spelled exactly right, but it was done from memory.
Yeah, and another thing to point out is that most of the people that your dad was talking about working with are probably deceased.
Absolutely true. Most of the guys that were privy to the information are no longer here, and that's why Dad was able to declassify. There were about 30 of them that were privy to this information, and they all agreed, like a battlefield oath among soldiers, the last to die can tell the story. But Dad was the last to die. General Sammet died right before him.
Wow. I mean, if General Trudeau was still alive, he would not have written this book, correct?
Absolutely correct.
See, that's where the chronology comes into play here. It's very important. That's why I wanted to try to break this down in stages tonight. And I think we did a pretty good job. So,
hey, I do too.
Okay, that's great. Hey, I really enjoyed having you on the program, Philip.
Okay, Jesse.
And I just want you to know, I want everybody listening tonight, there is a lot more to this story. Obviously, I'm learning about it as we go along, too. And I'm so glad, because if we want to progress, we have to open our minds, have a healthy dialogue. That's what the New Guard is all about. Phillip Corso, Jr., thank you for being on the program, sir, and you are always welcome here.
Well, I do appreciate it. And if I may just say one closing.
Of course.
I don't want anyone out there, especially the younger ones, to think that I'm lying or trying to promote myself. Whatever I'm saying, I want them to know that I believe I'm telling the truth.
Well, as I said last week, both James Fox and myself knew that neither you nor your father made money from that book, and no one is getting rich in ufology. And let's leave it at this. Your father had everything to lose by coming out with this information.
Right.
And he still chose to do it, We have to...
Correction, though, I did make a little bit of money after Dad passed away.
Okay, well, a little bit, but the kind of money that people have thrown out there, I'm sure, doesn't come into play.
It was nowhere near what it should have been,
Well, you did deserve some money, so good for you. I'm glad you did.
And we had to fight for the rights of the book back, too.
And you do have the rights now?
Yes.
Okay, that's an interesting, and we can bring that up next time about what you plan on doing with that, if anything.
I do.
Okay, fantastic. Phillip Corso Jr., thank you so much, and hopefully we'll be speaking to you soon.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you, sir. And we're joined tonight by Mr. Phillip Corso Jr. Welcome to the program, Phillip. Do you like Phillip or Phil?
Either one. Phil's fine.
Okay, great. Well, it's great to have you here. I know you don't do a lot of interviews, and I want to say thank you so much for taking the time and the trust to be on the program to talk about your father, because as we were talking about offline, not only are there lots of myths and misconceptions, but there is a lot of, I want to say disrespect, but in a certain way, I think we can probably clear up certain misconceptions tonight by having you on the program without even having to go all that deep. So thanks again for being here.
Sure.
Why don't you start off? Some of our audience members might not know that much about your dad. What we do know is that the day after Roswell, which was published in 1997, of course, really took the world by storm and turned it upside down in a lot of ways, both from a ufology perspective, from a technology perspective, from an intelligence perspective, and from a military perspective. So why don't you tell us about what your dad was like growing up and what kind of father he was?
Oh, sure. He was a great father. I mean, I didn't see him very much as a young boy.
I bet.
But he, as far as I'm concerned, he never exaggerated. He never cussed. He was religious, not overly. He spoiled me rotten, bought almost anything I wanted. My sons today, I have 3 sons, they still laugh about that. And, he was a great father. Later on in life, though, when my mom passed away about 5 years before 1997, he came and lived with us. And that was when I really got to know my father. Being the career that he was in, I look back now and I understand why he didn't have a lot of time for me and always get home late, and such like that.
Sure.
So I want the young people to know that this book was not easy coming. There was also a big controversy about Senator Thurman that wrote the foreword.
That's right.
And Senator Thurman fired the whole staff and said, "No, I did write the foreword to the book." And he fired his entire staff from the administrative assistant on down. And, of course, he had been made chairman of the Armed Forces Committee by then. And it was an embarrassment to his staff, he said. And Dad, the first 1,000 books will have a foreword by Senator Thurman. And Dad dropped it just where it wouldn't drop Senator Thurman's foreword in the book after the first 1,000 because he just didn't want any more controversy because Senator Thurman was a dear friend of his.
And there was others within government. Your father was friends with many people. I'm going to come back to some of these altercations and some of the possibly after effects of launching this and publishing this historical book. But I'm really trying to lay some groundwork first on just who he was. I mean, Ronald Reagan was someone that your dad spoke to and
very
advised.
Yeah. After Dad got out of the Army, Reagan would call often because he considered Dad the number one expert on you might say the KGB and communism and the Cold War at that time. So Reagan would take his advice.
It's incredible. Hey, you know what? We have to take a break. So what we're going to do here, we lay some groundwork on who your father was. If you haven't heard of this man, well, you're probably not a ufology buff, and that's okay. That's okay, because there's a lot to talk about tonight, and I really want you to get the true story, which is going to come from my guest tonight, Mr. Phillip Corso Jr., the son of the late, great Colonel Phillip Corso Sr. Okay, we're back now with my guest tonight, Mr. Phillip Corso Jr., talking about his dad, his father, to many, a amazing American period of time when he decided to come forward with a lot of these revelations. And I think that was really the downfall of why we haven't been able to put him in a place where he is more of a historical significance than he was at the time. And I want to reestablish that. So keep telling us about some of these amazing positions, because the one that really ended up sparking so much controversy was when he joined the Foreign Technologies Division, correct?
Yes. He knew General Trudeau before that, and of course General Trudeau is known for the charge up Pork Chop Hill in Korea. At the time Dad met General Trudeau in Korea, he was on the MacArthur staff as one of his head intelligence officers. Let me go back a little further. The way that Dad got started in this is he was GI, drafted into the Army, non-commissioned officer. Well, instantly in school they saw that he was had a photographic memory. And they said, you know, come here, son, you want to be an officer? He took the officer's candidate and passed the test. And they quickly sent him to Cambridge University in England and to learn intelligence. We had no intelligence at that time prior to the war. So, and I remember Dad saying all the time that the British would say, how green our ally. In other words, we didn't know nothing, they felt. So Dad learned intelligence, came back here after the war, went to Fort Riley, and taught intelligence there. And that's how his career, you might say, stepped to the next level, because then he went on to Korea. And because he had a photographic memory, he interrogated over 1,000 prisoners there himself.
Wow.
And he would believe everything they said, just the opposite of what most intelligence officers, and he stored it away. Well, pretty soon he realized, like any good Army officer, the enemy always knows how to destroy himself. I forgive him for that, though, because he was a great father. He never laid a hand on me, just a very nice, pleasant person. When I hear some of the stories that when he was G2 of Rome and how he would interrogate prisoners and some other very nasty stuff, it was hard to visualize my father as that type of person, but that's where his military career carried him.
Well, like you said, and we were talking about this offline a little bit, it's amazing how you can know someone and they have all this information in their head, but at the time, the world being such a different place back then, they were able to draw a line in the sand as far as what they'll talk about and what they just know that they're not allowed to talk about. So as far as your dad growing up, discuss some of the positions that he held. There were so many. We're talking about some very high-level positions in government.
Right. Well, I can remember as a young boy going down with him to the Blair House. The Blair House was across the street from the White House, and that's where a lot of the staff at that time stayed. And I was impressed because I would always, and there would be 2 armed guards there with Tommy guns. And, you don't see that in Washington, D.C. nowadays in the public. And I would go in there. And then another thing that always bothered me, my father was almost always in civilian clothes. And this is when he held, I'm going to say the job is Colonel North's job because more people were familiar with that later on. But my dad founded that job. And what it really was is liaison between the chiefs of staff of the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, all in the Pentagon, and Dad being on the White House staff next to Ike, he would carry Ike's orders over there. That's the way it was done in those days. So, that was a very high-profile job.
I'd say.
And you can look up his career on the Internet. It's there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like I said, there are some major titles that go underneath your father. That's why it is so important. And I think what we need to establish in this interview is that your dad was only on the scene, unfortunately, for a very short period.
So Dad was put on the Panmunjom peace talks, and he quickly, by interrogating, figured out a way to end the war. And that was they knew their weakness, and the weakness was you cut off their food supply, their rice, and the war would quickly end. And he had the Air Force take 3 take torpedoes and put delayed charges, drop them into the rice paddies for shallow running. And they went into these earth dams with delayed fuses, and bam, bam, bam. Dad said he walked into the Panmunjom meeting one day, and he says they were very arrogant, and he said they sensed that he had them. And the war ended. Now, I'm not saying my dad single-handedly ended the war.
Sure.
What I am saying is he played a large part in it on MacArthur's staff.
And did you learn about these specifics while you were growing up, or did you learn about them post when your father passed? When did you really learn about this chronology of all these major events that he was involved with?
Mainly during the 5 years that he lived with us after my mother's death.
Okay, because like you said, he wasn't around very much, right, understandably, while you were growing up.
Right. So then he went on to Ike's staff, and especially for the young people, I want them to hear this.
Sure.
Because Dad wrote the book mainly where the young could know. He feels that they have a right to know. He feels without them knowing that there could be a lot of problems in the future. If they know the problems, they will know how to solve them. And mainly he felt the young people could handle knowing that we have been visited and how things are taking place. And especially my sons. The book he did not get a penny from. He was cheated out of it. On his deathbed, he was very sorry that he wrote the book, and that's mainly because he didn't want to leave the family. We were sued by people back then we didn't even know. And finally, an attorney about a year later, when I was ready to burn all the notes, came to our rescue and put all the fires out in about 3 months' time.